Welcome, ONPS members, friends, acquaintances, and others that are watching this. We've got a wide audience, not only ONPS members, but a lot of other folks that are being orchestrated into the Native Plant Society virtual presentations, and you are all welcome. Tonight's presentation is by Laura Goodman, Dr. Laura Goodman, who is at OSU in the Natural Resource Ecology and Management Department. She's a Minnesota native. She initially wanted to study agronomy, ended up with a joint major, had some range management in there and fell in love with it. She got her master's program at New Mexico State and her PhD there. She's been in Stillwater since 2015, doing some patch burn grazing research. And boy, what a perfect time to talk about what's happening with native plants with prescribed burns and range management. So for those of you that are not familiar with this, you'll have the opportunity to pose questions. You can enter those, and during or at the completion of this, we'll have an opportunity to ask Dr. Goodman questions. Not related to this, but for ONPS members, you should be aware that we've got the WOW weekend coming up in May. You can check, if you're not familiar with that, you can check it out on the website. The registration for this, unfortunately, due to COVID, is extremely limited, and the website registration has now been capped out. I talked with Joe Roberts a few minutes ago. We still have a few slots left for the mail-in. So if you have not registered, please submit your registration, mail in, and there will be a waiting list. If we have folks that can't make it, your name will be held in the order that your registrations have been received. So give it some consideration. WOW should be a wonderful weekend in May. Without further ado, Dr. Laura Goodman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Patrick. Well, I'm excited to talk to you guys tonight. I've actually been following the group on Facebook, and what an awesome group of folks that are, learning about native plants, know a lot about native plants. And so I'm excited to share some of the research that's been done just on how these plants respond to prescribed fire. So there's a couple of different things that we need to think about when we talk about how plants respond. I'm just going to move this over a little bit. How plants respond to fire. And one of those is just some characteristics about the plants in particular. And so plants have different growth forms, and that can have an impact on how they're going to respond. The location of their buds, bark thickness, if we're talking about woody plants, those are all things that are going to help to determine how they respond. And many of the plants that we have in Oklahoma, of course, have developed with a long history of fire in general. And so they have special adaptations. Other things that can have an impact on how they respond would be environmental factors. And so these things would be like how much precipitation or rainfall they're getting before and after the fire. Also characteristics about the fire itself. So the intensity, the residence time that it's having, those can really determine how easily plants can respond and how quickly they can respond following the fire. Other things that also determine how plants respond would be management before and after. And so in grazed pastures, which, a large proportion of our native rangeland in Oklahoma is grazed by livestock, the number one thing that's going to determine their response is the stocking rate. And so we have other factors about grazing that can also be very important, like the timing of grazing. But stocking rate really is the number one aspect of grazing management that determines how they respond to anything. And so it can have a big impact in regards to how plants respond after being exposed to either wildfire or prescribed fire. So we're going to start out talking about grasses. I like grasses quite a bit, and there's been a lot of research to actually look at how grasses will respond to both wildfire and prescribed fire. And so I'm going to talk about some some particular species that, of course, we have here in Oklahoma. I think this group will be interested to hear, what about our grasses specifically? So I'll start with buffalo grass. And so buffalo grass, there's been quite a bit of research about buffalo grass with prescribed fire, and there's very little research that says that there's any negative impact for sure on buffalo grass from prescribed fire. With wildfire, there's also been research that's found that buds and seeds are rarely ever affected, and most of this is because the insulating factor of the soil. You don't have to go very far into the soil before there's quite a bit of insulation from temperature changes. The exceptions to this rule would be when you have wildfire that happens during drought. So if you have drought immediately before or after the fire, you can have some death of buds and seeds on buffalo grass. The other time that you can sometimes have some buffalo grass that dies from fire would be if you had a lot of woody plants, specifically here, it would be eastern red cedar. And it was burnt, so it caught fire and then burned for a really long time, and usually at pretty high surface soil temperatures. And so that can sometimes impact buffalo grass to some degree. I have a picture here of just a burr of buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is a plant that, you have separate male and female plants. And so this is a burr that the seed is housed within from a female plant. And so one of the instances that you might have death on buffalo grass during wildfire would be particularly if you have a backfire. And so we call a backfire is when you have the fire moving in the opposite direction of the wind. And so this picture is kind of showing what a backfire typically looks like. And because they move more slowly than a head fire, where the fire is moving with the wind, it can actually have more mortality on it when you have that type of fire burning. There's been, like I said, there's been lots of research looking at how buffalo grass responds. And if you look at kind of all of it as a whole, there's very little effect of fire. And in most cases, there's an increased production 1 year after fire. And so, of course, buffalo grass lives in lots of different states and across North America. And so these papers have been done in lots of different environments. And so here in South Dakota and Texas, and in the high plains, they found that buffalo grass production was actually greater in the growing season after a spring fire. In Kansas and some mixed grass prairie, they found buffalo grass production, and the cover was greater after burned areas by the fall after a spring burn. And that was actually a wildfire. So it took a little bit of time. It took that whole growing season. But it did recover by that following fall. And then in the shortgrass prairie of Kansas, another wildfire paper, they found that buffalo grass and blue grama production was decreased for a couple of years, and they happened to be pretty dry years. But then 3 years after the fire, it had returned to the same production as it had been previously. Blue grama, another one of our wonderful native grasses, is also generally responds very positively to fire. And so in general, it's going to increase or have no effect on blue grama. Much of the reason that we use prescribed fire, other than woody plant control, is also to provide really high quality forage for livestock when we're burning in pastures. And that definitely happens with blue grama. Fire can also increase the seed stock production and rhizome growth. And so blue grama is one of my favorite grasses, and it can grow in a bunch, or it can change and start growing. It triggers rhizome growth, and so the plant will start to spread out more and create a more sod forming grass when you burn it more. Production can actually decrease for 2 to 3 years if you have a fire that's again followed by drought. So these systems these grasses aren't responding in very different ways. Mainly, they respond positively unless there's something where they're not getting rain, and they might have decreased on their own even without the fire in those cases. Then we have little blue stem. Little blue stem is probably the plant that there has been the most controversy over of how it responds to fire. And so fall, winter, and spring burns generally are going to increase little blue stem production. And you can definitely see systems that get pushed to have more and more little blue stem. Some of the research plots down at Pushmataha Wildlife Management Area, we have a lot of little blue stem in the annually burned plots there, and the plots that are burned every 2 years as well. But the season of burn can determine how this plant responds. And so summer burns can damage the plant crowns and the basal buds in some cases. And so we do try to be careful if we have a really an area that's very dominated by little blue stem, just what time of year we're burning it. But generally on the eastern side of Oklahoma, we haven't seen a decrease in little blue stem with burning during the summer. With spring burns, you can also get an increase in the flower stalk production. And there was some research in West Texas in the mixed grass prairie where they found when they burned during dry years, they had a decrease of 42%, around there. And then in the wet years when they burned, it actually increased by 81%. So this plant seems to be very in tune to the environment surrounding the season that you're burning in. So if you have a wet season, it might be really beneficial to burn. And in a dry season, you might want to think twice. Now, in some cases, you can have almost a monoculture of little blue stem. And when you're actually trying to get diversity in there, you might actually pick a time of year where you think you might have a bigger impact on the little blue stem to try to open up that area for more broadleaf plants. So that's also something that you can think about with little blue stem. Then we have big and sand blue stem, and these plants love fire. So they can increase quite a bit with, especially following spring fire. And so some research we've found that this plant will even increase twofold when you have spring fire. The plants that are burned tend to grow more shoots, more leaves, more flowering stalks, kind of all of the above when they're burned. And so they really loved to be burned. There's pretty strong hormonal feedbacks that happen when this plant gets burned. And fire, the time when you wouldn't think that fire, the only time when fire doesn't increase big blue stem is when it's growing in really upland sites, which are probably, maybe marginal habitat anyway, if it's really dry or rocky. And when you have summer fire, again, followed by drought. So here's some interesting data that was from the Flint Hills of Kansas, and they looked at the percent composition after annual burns for 10 years. So this is kind of just as much fire as a system could almost support. And you can see we have 5 different species: side oats, grama, blue grama, buffalo grass, big blue stem, and little blue stem. And they compared the percent composition in areas that were unburned versus areas that were burned annually in March, areas that were burned annually in April, and areas that were burned annually in May. And you can see that pretty much all of the burns had a higher percent composition of these grasses than the unburned area. There was, that March 20th, it looks like the buffalo grass decreased a little bit in that one compared to the unburned, but for the most part, they're increasing, and they're increasing by quite a bit as far as percent competition. And so, these plants are just really highly adapted to fire. They respond very positively to fire in most cases. I wanted to show you some pictures that we took after the Anderson Creek wildfire, which happened in March of 2016. just to jog your memory. And we took pictures of some different areas to show you, just to kind of get off of the data for a little bit. So the picture on the left was taken 1 week after the wildfire. And then, of course, the picture on the right was 8 months after that wildfire. And I will say 2016 was a fairly wet year. So, I show these pictures with that caveat, but you can see here that these plants responded very, very strongly. A lot of this is sand blue stem, and it grew back very quickly after this wildfire. You can see the lack of most of the woody plants, and we'll talk about woody plants a little bit here too. So here again, just two photo comparisons. We have 1 week after wildfire on the left, and then 8 months after wildfire on the right. And you can see that the fire, many of the grasses grew back. The cedars, although they don't look completely dead in the left, many of them did end up dying after a number of months. And you can see that in the photo on the right. So let's just talk about a couple of woody plants as well, because of course they're really important native plants that we have too. So sand sagebrush is, also a native plant and unique amongst the sagebrushes, the artemisias, because it responds positively to fire, which is not true of most of our Western sagebrushes. And so with prescribed fire and wildfire, this research was from near Woodward, and what we found with this research was that the number of plants, the density of plants was the same in the burned and unburned areas very, very quickly after fire. So there actually wasn't like a change in the number of plants. There wasn't any mortality. With the height and the shrub canopy area, there was a decrease after the fire, but it was normal after 1 to 4 years. So it depended on what kind of environment that plant was growing in, how quickly it recovered. So it ranged from 1 to 4 years. And then there was some mortality. The density didn't change on most of it, but there was some mortality on some areas. And in those areas, the mortality ranged from 4 to 12%. And just to point out that most sagebrushes, this is not the case. They do not regrow after fire. So here you can see some of the other woody plants that were in this same area. And so there was sand plum, eastern red cedar, smooth sumac, and skunk bush sumac. And the eastern red cedar, the mortality was 95%. So that, we know that plant does not resprout, is very effectively killed by fire. And this was wildfire, so it was killing even large trees. There was some mortality on sand plum. So about 7% of the sand plum did end up dying, but there was no mortality on the smooth sumac or the skunk bush sumac. So those plants just regrew and had, no mortality on them. So now I'd like to transition into the flowering plants, the broadleaf plants. I have lots of pretty pictures, and we'll talk about some specific research that we've done here just west of Stillwater. And this has been done, John Weir and I together have worked on this research. These are research plots that he has had for quite a long time. And when I came here in 2015, we started brainstorming what kind of research we could do on those plots. And one of the things we were interested in is how the season of burn might impact the flowering abundance and diversity within those plots. And so just to orient you to the research plots that we work at, we have 7 different treatments where we are burning. Each treatment is burned in one of 2 months. So the first treatment would be burned in either July or August, September, October, and we needed a little bit of flexibility to make sure that we would be able to get the burn done just because of weather issues. And so we have these different months that we burn in, And then the last treatment, number 7, is a no burn treatment. And so these plots have been burned every 2 years for 17 years. So it's been going on for quite a while. Our burn cycle starts in July, August and ends in May, June. And we actually just finished up year 4 of this study. And there's 2 replicates of each of our treatments. And we started going out in April of every year, every 2 weeks, and we'd write down every flowering broadleaf plant that we saw in the plot. And then we wrote down, we kept track of how abundant they were. So we just had categories of abundance. And so it's been a really great study, a really interesting study. And so I'd like to share just some of the results that we've been finding. These aren't final. We haven't finished up this publication yet, but like I said, we went out every 2 weeks and wrote down flowering plants, and you'd be surprised how quickly these areas change, and that the plants will flower and then be gone. And then there's some other plants that will just persist and flower for months. And so it was a really fun project to work on. And so we just lumped these in very broad categories. There was 1 flowering plant, there was less than 10 and greater than 10 were how many we saw in these plots. I will say the whole area that we're working in is less than 2 acres. So these plots are not very large. So of course, we're not capturing every plant that could be out there, but they have been going for a long time. So we thought that it would be valuable to know how our native broadleaf plants are responding to this many years of burning. Here's one of the plants that we've found out there, range ratney. A lot of people don't notice this plant because it's usually kind of in the understory of grasses, but it's a really beautiful plant that is native to Oklahoma. Okay, so getting into some of the data, we started out pretty basic. We just wanted to look at the number of species that we found in all of the different treatments. And so this is showing the number of species for the treatments based on what months they were burned. And here you can see that our spring burns and our no burn, had the lowest numbers of species. Our July through December burns, so July, August, September, October, and November, December, had the highest numbers of species that we picked up. This is showing, I've got some controls that are kind of in the way here. This is the number of individual flowering plants, by burn treatment as well. And this is the categories of how many plants we were actually seeing. And so you can see that the July, August burns had the most flowering plants by far. So they had the most number of times that we counted greater than 10 plants per species flowering. And September, October were second to that. The March, April, and the May, June had were similar to our no burn. So those spring burns, those March, April burns really do push it to a mostly grass dominated system. And they do not help with increasing the number of flowering plants. Surprisingly, May and June, that's also the case. Let's see. So then I just looked at the rare species. And so these were found in only 1 season of burn treatment. So there were some species that we just didn't find very, very frequently. And so I wanted to go ahead and look at those. And we found the most of these, they're not actually rare across the state. They just were only found in 1 treatment. And so the most rare species we found was in that July, August burn, and next was September, October. So also an interesting finding that we weren't really expecting. We had 28 species found in only 1 treatment. So there were, I wouldn't say that this is 100% that those plants only like burning at that time, but there is a lot of information we just don't really know. Oh goodness, this is crazy. So I just threw a bunch of plants that we found in only one season of burn, and this is kind of the list. This is we won't dwell on this, but if somebody has a question about it later, we can come back to it. Then there was these generalist species, and these were found in all the different seasons of burn. And so some of these won't surprise you guys very much at all. We had antelope horn milkweed, tall thistle, daisy fleabane, of course, Sericea lespedeza. And then we had slender lespedeza, cat claw sensitive briar, passion flower, scurf pea, and pitcher sage. And so these plants weren't picky about when they were burned. Or whether they were burned. They were actually also found in the controls. And then we had these plants that I lumped in a category called fire-dependent generalists. So they were present in all of the burn plots, but they were not present in the no burns. And so the three of these plants, we found 3 plants that were this way, and that was lead plant, light poppy mallow, and false garlic were the 3 that we found in all of the burn plots, but not in our controls. And the lead plant, I think that that's fairly interesting. I work with a lot of ranchers, and I see a lot of lead plant on ranches that I know do prescribed burning. And I interestingly don't see a lot of lead plant on ranches that don't use prescribed fire. So I actually found a couple other research papers that had also hinted that they thought that this plant was a fire dependent plant. Okay, so now I just wanted to show you some of the data for a couple of species because I think it's really fascinating. We'll start with green antelope horn milkweed. And this is, of course, a perennial native, and it was found in all of our treatments. This group probably knows more than most. Its uses are native bees, bumblebees, honeybees, monarch nectar source plant. This is a pretty important plant and extremely common across Oklahoma. Here, I just looked at how common this plant was in the different burn treatments. And then I looked at how common they were across the season. So the line that you see at the very top is showing the July-August burn. And you can see that we had the greatest count data of the number of flowering plants in that July-August burn. And the one that we had the lowest was in the no burn, which is really hard to see, but it's a blue line and it's the lowest line on the graph. Our May-June burns, which are the green line, actually pushed flowering back to mid-June through August. So if you were trying to provide food later in the year, you might think of using a May-June burn to be able to accomplish that. And all treatments had flowering plants for 6 to 8 weeks. So these plants do flower for a pretty long time. And I'm not saying that the same exact plant would be flowering that long, but you have blooming happening for a while with these plants. Another one that's been interesting is scurf pea. And so this is a perennial native. It was also found in all of our treatments. And of course, this one has lots of uses as well. It's well documented that native bees and bumblebees use this plant. Here again with scurf pea, our July, August, that purple line was very, very low. There was a long bloom time. Plants flowered for the longest, which was 4 months, and at the greatest number in our July, August burn plots. So we were pretty shocked by that. Every time we went out there and sampled, there it was. Then I just wanted to look at some of our annuals because we didn't know exactly what was going to happen with our annuals. And so I picked Black-Eyed Susan as one to just kind of investigate a little bit about. Of course, so this is an annual, it's native. Its uses include butterflies, larval host, for Gargan checker spot, bordered patch butterfly also uses this plant. And so it's just another important and fairly common plant too. So here is the Black-Eyed Susan data. You can see that the July, August, and September, October burn plots had the greatest number and the longest period of flowering. So the blue line that's really, really high is the September, October treatments. And the July, August is the purple line, which you can't see because it's directly underneath the blue line. And so both of those treatments had a lot of Black-Eyed Susans blooming in them. So my take-home message from this study is that we really just had the greatest species diversity in the late summer and fall burns. We also had the greatest quantity of flowering plants with our burns that were from July through October. And so the season of burn can really change when flowering plants are available for different insects, and we'll have more data to present in the future as we look at the time since fire and how plants are responding, a couple years after fire. And so we'll, be checking us out on social media to see what we share as far as that goes. We have a Facebook page called Oklahoma Lands. And so we regularly like to share some of our research results there. If we have a second, I have one little video I would like to share. And it's just showing a prescribed fire actually happening. Do we have some time for that, Patrick?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and I'll share a new screen. I'm getting it, sorry. All right, here we go. All right. Hopefully that wasn't super, super loud.
It's good.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show the video so you could see an actual prescribed fire on the ground. That's a pasture that we have out at one of our research stations. And we actually burn patches of that pasture to provide forage throughout the year and also to create plant species diversity and structural diversity for wildlife. And so it's worked really, really well. And we've actually added goats to the mix as our grazer in the last year. So we're going to track how that goes as well.
Laura, on the plots that you've been studying that John's been studying for 17 years, is there any grazing or other use of this, or is it just burned?
Those plots are just burned. Yep, they are not grazed by any livestock, and so we do have some species in there that you don't see as often in grazed pastures.
Okay. And the other question, you had quite a diversity of species in there. Has it been planted, or what was the origin of this land? Was this Bermuda grass pasture that has been converted, or what's the
I
origin?
don't know what the long-term history of it. A lot of the research station, was farmed at one point. A lot of it was in cotton at one point, but not recently. And prior to his study, at the beginning of his study, it was predominantly just tall grass prairie. So the control plots now have quite a bit of cedar. There's some other plants in there as well. There's blackberry. We do have some Mexican plum in some of them as well. But it was predominantly grasses to start out with. It wasn't planted with any broadleaf, no forb seeds were planted there. So it's just been what's growing in there now happened naturally.
Okay. Do you have anything else before we open it up to questions, Laura?
No, I don't think so.
Adam, do you have any comments or questions that have come in?
Well, it was a great presentation, and thank you for doing that, Laura. We do have a couple of comments and questions from, there's one from Jay. Jay asks, have you seen reductions in Indian paintbrush with March and April burns?
I haven't looked at the Indian paintbrush specifically in our data. We have found it in those plots, so I can look at that and see. I would guess that if it's responding similarly to our other broadleaf plants, that the March-April burns would not be beneficial, but I don't know exactly. One source that I use a lot for looking for research on how our native plants have respond to fire is the U.S. Forest Service has a fire effects information system webpage. That's the title of the webpage. And it is such an excellent resource that has, they've written kind of how any research that's been done on fire effects on each species is available there. So you can just look up the species you're interested in, and they have lots of information. So I would look there for more information. Otherwise, you can always email me, and I can try to see if I can find anything more about it. We haven't looked at that specifically, so I can't tell you from our plots.
All right. The only other comment we have is from Dervis. It says, great video.
Oh, thanks.
And we will, of course, archive this so folks can go back and watch that, but I'm sure that's something that can be watched on YouTube separately as well.
Yeah, we have it's Oklahoma State Natural Resources Extension is the YouTube channel. But if you follow our Oklahoma Lands Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, we have posted all those videos on there too. So if you do social media, that's a great place to find those.
Okay.
Well, Laura, thank you very much for taking the time to give this very insightful presentation. I think the take home is, if you've got if you've got pasture land or a large plot and you're trying to favor the grasses for cattle or grazing, then the spring burns. And if you're trying to increase the diversity, maybe more of a wildflower plot in your backyard or in your pasture, then perhaps the July, August, September, October burns would be more appropriate. And if you want some lead plants, you gotta burn it.
You got to burn it. It loves it.
Well, so the Oklahoma Native Plant Society, Laura, is going to offer you a membership for the next year.
Thank you.
For giving this presentation, and hopefully we'll have some in-person events between now and when your membership has expired, and hopefully we'll get a chance to, myself and lots of our other members I'm sure would love to interact with you.
Yeah, that would be really, really great. I hope
Okay.
so.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to give this. I'll tell the audience that's listening, be sure and watch or look at your newsletter, the Gaillardia, or pay attention to the emails. Native Plant Society will send one out the first Thursday in April. We'll have Dr. Laura Souza from OU, who will be talking about native plants and their changes or their adaptation to global and climatic changes. So it'll be pretty much in tandem with what you talked about today.
Great.
Once again, thank you very much. And if there's no other questions, Adam, we'll adjourn this.
All right. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks.